Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today, and welcome to Humentum's Operationalizing Locally-Led Development Series 2023, Models to Transform Risk and Compliance. All right, so I have a couple of quick slides to go through before I hand it over to our moderator, who will introduce today's speakers. First, a big thank you to our industry partners. Their support and expertise help make Humentum's work possible.
Alexa off.
Next, I would like to remind everyone that we will continue to host webinars to support our members and their work. And here are a few of our upcoming events, including webinars and roundtables. I will share a link to the upcoming events and connect in the chat after this. And then a few housekeeping notes. All attendees are currently muted. To ask questions, please feel free to type in the chat box. You can access the chat box by clicking on the chat bubble at the bottom of the screen. Questions will be kept until the end unless it clarifies something like an acronym or if the panelist or the moderator feels comfortable pulling it into the discussion. So feel free to engage with us throughout the session, and we will do our best to address all your questions. Subtitles are available for this webinar. To turn them on or off, please click on Captions or Live Transcription on your Zoom toolbar, then show or hide based on your preference. And we would like to kindly request, do not change the language of the subtitles, as it will affect the transcription of the whole webinar. This webinar will be recorded, and a recording along with any additional materials will be emailed later this week. Check your spam folder if you do not receive it in your inbox. With that, I am very excited to introduce and hand over the session to our moderator, who will introduce today's panelists, Shila Nhemi, who is the Technical Director, Risk and Compliance at Humentum. Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining this webinar. Over to you, Shila.
Thanks so much, Helen. And hi, everyone, from wherever it is in the globe you're joining us from. And welcome so much to today's webinar. And I think we know that when it comes to locally led development, there's been a lot of discussion that centers around risk, accountability, and compliance, because the idea is that development needs to be led by local organizations, and with funders and international intermediaries trusting in the capacity of local partners rather than tightly controlling the funds. Of course, this shift in power dynamics has raised a lot of questions, and mainly the questions have to do with risk and compliance, especially on how do we balance the need for accountability and risk management while avoiding being overly restrictive or having very restrictive emphasis on compliance. And that's the focus for today's discussion. We are very privileged to be joined by a team of very distinguished and very experienced experts who will share with us their insights and approaches to risk and compliance from the lens of locally led development. They'll share their experiences on how different risk and compliance models have influenced their operations. Then they'll also shed some light on some challenges they are facing and even present to us some practical solutions that we can adapt. So thank you for choosing to spend your time with us today. And please join me in welcoming the following panelists. We have Caroline, who's the Director for Partnership and Development at TechSoup. We have Catherine, who's the Team Leader, Organization Development and Education at Kenya Community Development Foundation. We have Leah, who's the Deputy Director for Impact and Learning at Stephen Lewis Foundation. We have Molupe, who's the Executive Director at TouchRoots Africa. And we have Sergey, who's the Senior Director, Enterprise Risk and Compliance at Catholic Relief Services. So welcome so much to our webinar. And I think the first thing, as we are starting, I'd like to just hear from all our panelists for them to just briefly tell us what their understanding of the role of risk and compliance is in the whole debate of operationalizing locally led development. And maybe I'll just start with you, Caroline. You can give us your understanding, then I'll call on the other panelists.
Sure, thank you, Sheila, and hello, everybody. Yeah, so I think I'd just like to start with maybe making just a couple of points. And first, you've touched on it already, Sheila. You know, I think people are talking about risk and compliance a lot and trying to work our way through that. At the same time, it has felt to me quite often a bit like the elephant in the room, because you know, really tackling this issue is at the heart of the power dynamic that really needs to be addressed if we are to, you know, shift the way that we do things, and that, of course, you know, local ownership, locally led development is more than just funding and more than just financing, and it thinks about, you know, communities and their autonomy and their ability to shape their own agenda according to their unique needs and their aspirations. But it's self-evident that funding is, you know, a key pillar to this. And despite commitments to locally led development, I still hear that, you know, small organizations, local organizations are still considered to be fundamentally more risky, less reliable, lower in capacity than larger established organizations. And I think, you know, often international NGOs, obviously. And so, you know, what we see is that donors are still prioritizing organizations that already have sort of pre-existing strong risk management and compliance systems. And so larger, better established organizations continue to capture most funding. And it's not just the funding, we know that it's also, with funding comes kind of visibility and access. And so we see just the perpetuation of the existing imbalance and existing funding structures that we know we want to change. The second thing that I'd like to say, sort of touch on quickly, is I think we need to expand this beyond just thinking about risk and compliance to meet the needs of funders, to access funding, you know, a grant, and think about how important it is. Like, strong systems and strong practices are important just for organizations generally, and to build resilient organizations, to foster transparency and accountability and responsible practices. That is just a value, I think, and we should all be thinking about that when we think about an enabling environment. And so not supporting this and thinking about that in terms of the infrastructure of civil society and the infrastructure of an organization is really important to support. Because if we don't do that, we're actually limiting those organizations further, because they become more susceptible to financial, legal, reputational, operational risks, which, you know, can erode further trust and really inhibit their ability to deliver. So I think just broadening our conversation and taking away from just like compliance with what donors need and thinking about it in the broader context is from my point of view, quite an important way to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caroline, for that view on the need to just broaden this conversation much more than just funding and funds and finance. So I'd just like to also welcome Catherine. From your point of view, what's your understanding of the role of risk and compliance in operationalizing locally led development?
And thank you so much for this opportunity to be in this webinar. For me, I see the role of risk and compliance very critical in engaging with the civil society. One is to look at there's the need for any person who wants to engage with organizations to sort of get the comfort of that they know the status of the organization as they get in. And for me here, when you're talking about risk and compliance, it's more to look at where you're identifying areas that either are of, let me not to weakness, but areas of strengthening. Then that helps you as you begin to consider engaging with the organizations, that what are the areas of support. And that's a bit of what Caroline has talked about. But I think more important for me when you look at about risk and compliance is context. Because we have different lenses from where we come from. But having risk and compliance, really applying context to the specific where the organization is important when you're looking at risk and compliance. And so for me, I think really working with understanding what is the local context really does bring home to the issue on the role of risk and compliance, so that you then judge or come to a conclusion about a CSO or CSOs that you want to work with based on where they actually are. That is what I would contribute in addition to what Caroline has said.
Thanks so much, Catherine, and your input on the need to just look at the context when it comes to the discussion. So Leah, please tell us your understanding of the role of risk and compliance in the whole debate of locally led development.
I want to echo a lot of what Caroline has shared, because really, I mean, you know, as funders, particularly, one of the things that we're continuing to do is really reflect on our values. And that has implications for the language that we use, particularly in the context of international development work, which is inherently very colonial in practice. So before you even get to the material implications of what compliance and risk look like, I feel like the language around risk and compliance needs to be interrogated further. I feel like compliance is a very disempowering term. You know, language matters, as does practice. And I feel like language has the power to disempower, and it has the power to externalize and other. And so when I think about context in relationship to, particularly around compliance, I think we need to transform the language a bit more. And that means interrogating our own kind of value systems and really walking the talk. You know, if we say that we want to invest in community-led partners, what does that mean? What does a relationship built on trust and mutual accountability and respect look like? And do we want to lead with conversations around risk and compliance in those conversations when they have very punitive implications in the way that they manifest themselves in those relationships? And so I think that we first need to start with interrogating just the language we're using around relationship building, partnership, and what that looks like to make it more inclusive and really in alignment with the needs of community-based organizations and less one-dimensional. Because when we talk about compliance, it's often directed at the implementing partner with very little implication for funders. And then when we talk about risk, you know, it's usually in terms of financial risk, when really we realize there's so many other risks involved in international development work, which undermine the partnership. So, you know, when we talk about doing no harm, that's a risk that implementing partners, you know, us as funders have in the relationship. We talk about the risk of not being inclusive with the implementing partners that we're working with, the risk of not actually hearing what their needs are, the risk of imposing structures and systems that don't meet those needs. So those are risks other than financial risk when it comes to partnering with local community-based organizations. And so I think the first step is really interrogating our own value systems, really interrogating the way we show up in those relationships, and transforming the language around risk and expanding the language around risk and compliance. And really what we really want is accountability, trust, and transparency in relationships. So what systems do we need to apply to support those processes, and how do we include community-led organizations in those conversations so they're not one-dimensional and one-directional, and so that both organizational needs are met? And, you know, I think that's the piece. Yeah.
Thanks, Leah, for a very detailed concept. And especially for me, I picked the fact that we really need to look at the language that we are. And, you know, as you were talking, I kept asking myself, so what other language? But anyway, it's about triggering those questions that we need to really ask ourselves. So I'll invite Molupe for your inputs also on your understanding of the role of risk and compliance in operationalizing locally led development.
Okay, thank you, Shila. In our context, as a community-based organization, I would define risk as minimizing potential for diversion of funds to what they are intended, to what they are not intended for, or potential misuse of funds. And compliance, I would say it's conforming with the requirements while utilizing the funds in the implementation of the project. Yeah, I think I would put it as simple as that. Thank you.
Thanks, Molupe, for your inputs in that. And so I'll move also to Sergey, and for you just to tell us also your understanding of the role of risk and compliance in operationalizing locally led development.
Thank you, Shila, and hello, everyone. It's good to be here with you. The panel has demanded me to wear this T-shirt that I wore during our preparation call. So I think my answer is partly represented on my T-shirt. And thank you, panelists, for sharing your rich insights and how you perceive risk and compliance for locally led development. I think in the end, let me simplify just by adding, in the end, it's about trust. So risk and compliance is just a token of trust that and in a way to align around the accountability, transparency, objectives, alignment of objectives, and understanding really the ethical and rules-based outlook. What are the priorities for the funders and the recipients? Risk and compliance is in a way not only a token, but also a language to communicate and understand those priorities as the funders, as well as the local leaders are communicating through these very technical documents in its project implementation. So in the end, the risk and compliance functions are going to help responsible, transparent, accountable implementation of activities, and which will identify the planning for various threats as well as the opportunities throughout the project that would generate value or would diminish value for both the funders as well as for the recipients. So I think when I was taking on the role of the risk management and compliance in my organization, the first thing that we try to unpack is that what is it? Are these just the rules that we need to follow, or are these just the communication tools by the funders to understand what is important to them? And it is then our responsibility to unpack it within our organizations to understand why really those rules do exist. What do those rules strive to achieve? And really understanding the position of the funder in that case is very important, and as well as contribute. So when we're talking about what is the role of risk and compliance in locally led development, I think it's a two-way street. So I've just explained one part of it, and then the other part of it is for the funders to listen to the complexities on the ground, to the local context, to what issues are real and what issues are not so real in the areas where we work, and adjust those requirements and try to communicate and meet somewhere in the middle. At least that would be the role of risk and compliance. So it's a communication tool, it's a language, and it's a token of trust. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sergey. I think you've also kind of summarized what everybody else has also put together. And now I'll come back to you, Caroline. And I'd like you to tell us more about the STEP initiative that TechSoup has, what it's all about, some lessons learned, and just take us through the whole initiative of STEP.
With pleasure, but I will try and do that in a concise way. So if it's very high level, please, obviously we can, I can see questions in chat and you can unpick anything that I've said. But please, Shila, if I go on too long, do stop me. But in a nutshell, we as TechSoup, just to take a little step back, TechSoup is not really known, I think, for the vetting and validation work that we do. We have a couple of services beyond STEP that sort of help kind of increase the visibility of organizations. Really what TechSoup wants to do is make more organizations more visible to more funders. And that could be from technology product, but it can also be in terms of money. And so STEP is a service that fits into kind of a broader stable of work. It's very much influenced by a program called NGO Source, which for anyone who's in the United States from a private foundation will probably use. And if any organization, any non-profit organizations outside the United States have received money from a private foundation in the United States, you will no doubt have had to go through an equivalency determination. And our general counsel and the woman who heads up NGO Source is on this call too. So any questions you can direct to her. But the reason I raise it is because it's based on this repository model. So NGO Source has been running very successfully for a good decade now and is streamlining those equivalency determinations so that an organization only has to go through it one time, over a period, and then it can be used, that equivalency determination can be used by multiple funders. And what we want to do with the STEP program is kind of replicate that process so that instead of an organization having to go through multiple requests for due diligence or risk compliance processes to get a grant, they can just have one evaluation that they can share with multiple funders. And we're really trying to sort of streamline and reduce the friction and the fragmentation that exists today in how all these processes are undertaken. And so STEP is really what we call a tiered due diligence framework. And I can explain that a little bit in a minute. But we look at compliance, due diligence across 9 streams. Some that are kind of, and forgive my language, Leah, I totally hear what you said, that I'm using horrible words and sometimes it's kind of for want of anything better, really. So please, suggestions in the chat. But, the kind of common due diligence questions around governance and legal compliance and finance, but also some others that are increasing interest and importance, say digital security and privacy and safeguarding, and how you work with your implementing your other partners that you may be giving grant funding to. So it tries to be a very holistic evaluation. We have developed this very much in consultation with funders, a really kind of broad range of funders, be that bilateral donor agencies, private foundations, international NGOs, but really with a focus, so because we want to meet their needs, but really with a focus on the organization and the CSO. How can we make this as useful as possible for them, and so that they're really benefiting from the process? And so that's kind of always been at the heart of how we've developed the framework and the evaluation process. Picking up on the point that Catherine made. So Catherine, as you know, is from the KCDF, who are a very valued partner of TechSoup in many ways, but we're working very closely with them and other global network partners on not only developing the framework, but implementing these evaluations. And so as evaluators, to this point of making sure that an evaluator really understands kind of the organization, the local context, because they can give a better, more full evaluation that way. And also it's much better for the organization going through the evaluation because they feel that they can speak the same language, as it were, really be understood, and that can really be demonstrated in full in their evaluation. So we've got the framework, the way that the evaluations are conducted, and with that local expertise. And then the third element that I'd just like to touch on, which is really important for us, is this organizational strengthening piece. Because the other thing that we've heard from civil society organizations as we've done our work is, not only the burden of going through multiple due diligence requests and processes and how duplicative it is, but also it can feel very opaque and kind of a black box. And you go through these, you answer all the questions, and you may get the grant, or you may not, but you don't really know why not quite often. There's no feedback given, or quite often feedback isn't given. So it feels quite extractive for the civil society organization. So how can we make that better and really make sure that they are gaining from the process? So one thing that we do is work very closely with them, and that the report that is produced goes to them as well as to the funder, so that they have that. The report not only talks about what they do well, as well as areas for improvement, but we produce a series of recommendations. And so those recommendations are then, we hope, made useful to the organization. So should they decide to improve the areas that we pointed out, they can do so. And so the final thing that we built, but is in development, is what we're calling a resource portal. And really it's a curated area, because there's such a wealth of resources that already exist for many organizations doing great capacity building work. So it's really bringing that into one place through the sort of step framework lens, if you like, and saying, well, if you've been given recommendations around governance or financial management, here are some guides, some manuals, some videos, some courses, some templates, some policy templates that can help you really get to grips with those recommendations and make those improvements. And so really we want to have it very holistic, a real journey for the organization, so that it doesn't end with just the evaluation, but really kind of walks with them the whole way through to actually improving some of their practices. I'll take a pause there so I don't keep talking.
Thanks, Caroline, for that introduction into the STEP initiative, and maybe just also hear from Catherine's end, because Catherine is a key partner and actually an implementer and an evaluator of the STEP, and also just to hear from her how it's actually working, and from also your experiences when you implement it with certain organizations. Are you seeing any differences? Are there organizations that are able to actually reach the higher levels of the steps? And just for you to share that with the team. Yes.
Okay, thank you. At Kenya Community Development Foundation, KCDF, our focus is really on community-driven development. So as we get into a partnership with NGOs or CBOs or any civil society organization, we do first consider what exactly does the organization want to do, what is their interest in terms of development. And then once we establish that what they want to do and what KCDF is looking at doing we could support, then now the process of establishing capacity development areas then kicks in. And for that reason, we have then gotten into partnership with TechSoup because of our approach to working on identifying organizations. So in terms of our partnership with TechSoup, we got the opportunity to first review the STEP process as a CSO, as the organization that would be assessed. Just so that we could, once you get the experience, you run through the tool and you're able to respond to the tool, we were able to identify areas that we felt may need to be adjusted in terms of context and any feedback that then helped to strengthen the tool. And so then that's meaning that you are wearing at the heart of the CSO that is being assessed. And then we went through a process of reviewing the application, therefore wearing the hat of an assessor or a reviewer of the application. And so that gave us also the opportunity to then experience what it would be like to then, in terms of the feedback that was given. So what happened in this step process, we partnered with other organizations in different regions in Africa, so that we shared our application so that we were reviewing another organization's application. That way we were able to get the feel of how is the tool, and are there areas we felt either language or questions did not seem to fill the context in which we are. And so we went through that process and was able to give feedback. Then after that, KCDF then and the other partners also then went ahead and shared, identified organizations like in Kenya and in the region that would then participate in the process, so that then they could fill in the application or respond to the various questions. And then that allowed us then to provide that support to them and review the tools. Now, what was useful here was that as the local organization, when the CSO filled in the application form, and we reviewed the tool and saw there were gaps, we were able to engage them directly and ask them to consider this particular question, their response, and support them to interrogate the response they had given, and if there was a document that they were to upload and was not available, we would then engage them to see, is this information available in a different, in what format is this information available in your own context? So that way they did not feel that they were restricted by being asked to upload a certain policy document. So for example, a question could, in the standard, or could be required, would be available in a finance manual, for example. But then in their context, where is that information then available? So we would support them to reflect and see where would they find this information in terms of responding. So then we then did go through a reviewer of the applications of those partners, and we were able to generate reports to them, which basically was, we were able to then give information on what are the areas that have emerged that would need support. What also this process was helpful was that the STEP process allows any organization at any level to do the assessment and then categorize. You're able to categorize the organization. So it gives an opportunity for any organization to be able to be assessed, and then give then it gives the opportunity to all of them. So you're actually able to then look at the organizations at different levels and then see how you want to engage even as a funder, because then a funder will then see what's the area that I will then support. So from that process, you're able to identify any areas of strengthening, and that partner actually gets a report from which then they're able to follow through on any areas they need to strengthen, and then also using the repository or the information or documents that are available in the portal, then they can also get that support to use that information. And the organizations that were assessed were really did give positive feedback, because they, first of all, were able to see areas they needed strengthening, and they were also happy to find that they had suggestions of where they could get information that they could use in terms of where they felt they had gaps. Yeah, so that was our experience with the STEP process. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline and Catherine. I think that's part of what we were saying, the experiences on practical tools that we can use in terms of risk and compliance within locally led development. And I know there are several questions that have been raised. We will follow up on that, but I'd like to also give Leah an opportunity for her also to share from her organization in terms of their approach for risk and compliance. I know as a foundation, you have a very different approach to all this, and it's just good to be able to share with the rest, and also just give also your own input on maybe some of the challenges that are hindering the efforts from a local NGO perspective, but also from a foundation perspective. How are you really approaching this, and just the interesting way you're looking at this? Welcome, Leah.
Thank you. So the foundation has been around for about 20 years, and I just want to talk about the origins of the foundation, because I think that plays a large role in the way that we do things. And it evolved out of a recognition that community-led organizations really were the folks doing a lion's share of the work in community. They knew their communities best, and that they were really the ones who were plugging much of the gaps in terms of the national response around HIV and AIDS, but they weren't receiving the resources or the credit that they deserved for the work that they were doing. So the foundation sought to think about how we could get funds to partners directly without going through intermediary funders. And that meant, that we were working with organizations who, were very small, and that some of the structures that you're talking about weren't necessarily in place, and that was okay with us. I think we also have to question why some of these things inherently matter, and what the value system around some of these practices is, when you think about things about compliance, I think at the heart of it, and not to get too airy-fairy, is about relationships. Like, we're trying to establish relationships with partners who are doing invaluable work. And what does that mean? And what does that look like? Where do we start with that? And the first place that we start is recognizing that they have the skill set and the expertise in many areas, and that we underestimate often the skill set and expertise that exists and rest within community. And so we don't implement our own projects. Partners tell us, what they'd like to do. And we try to find the resources for that to happen. And that includes providing core flexible funding to support some of the strengthening of systems and structures on their own terms, along their own continuum of their own journey as an organization. They may not start with the most robust financial, structures, but in time, with consistent funding, consistent time for them to reflect on their own priorities and their own directions, and the space to do that without imposing certain structures and systems on them that may not necessarily resonate with their current structure or how they choose to work, or the fact that a lot of attention is spent on actually doing the work itself, which is really the heart of all of this, right? Is the actual work that folks are doing, not necessarily all the checks and balances. While those things matter, I think that what really matters is the impact that they're able to have in their communities, and with the folks who they're really accountable to, which is their beneficiaries and their clients, and not to us as funders. I think, so we try to set out systems that are as flexible as possible, that provide funding for the long term. So again, redefining what sustainability looks like in the context of funding initiatives, providing multi-year grants for folks so they can plan accordingly, not project-related funding, so that they can support the organizational growth on their own terms. So core funding that supports salaries, that supports rents, that supports some of the things that folks don't want to fund or don't see the value in funding. But the truth is, if you want to talk about accountability and due diligence, then you have to give folks the space and the finances to create those systems in accordance with their own values and in the time that they need to do that. That's not time bound to a particular project, but can be meaningfully internalized for the long term. And so I think, we have also M&E structures in place. Not to say that we don't have structures, we have financial reporting structures, we have, other agreements that have to be in place, because we're also intermediary funder and are kind of hemmed in sometimes by external funding that we also receive. And so what we try to do is minimize the administrative burden on partners as much as possible, recognizing that a lot of time around compliance is spent meeting administrative requirements, whereas, what really needs to be done is the work, as opposed to sitting down at a desk all day trying to, do timesheets and logic models and some of the things that prohibit people from actually being able to do the things that they're passionate about and caring about. And so I think it's just, providing structures that are flexible, contextually specific, and not generic. We really try to treat each partner as a relationship. And so it's very onerous and labor intensive sometimes. When partners have issues, we sit down and look at that partner's issues in the specifics of that partnership. And so, if you can't, submit your funding proposal because there's many challenges going on, that's okay, so I think it's just about relaxing some of the, when I hear some of these conversations, I also think, how do we relax some of this a little bit more? Like, what is the intent of it? Like, I know that we need to understand, we need to have financial processes in place for due diligence. I know that we need to have a comprehensive assessment of risk in fiduciary relationships. But like, is that the place that we want to start? And, is that like where, I think from the foundation's perspective, we really try to invest in partnerships, try to invest in relationships, and put the relationship at the center of the conversation. And once you build trust with folks, all else flows, because then you can have those conversations about, hey, what do we need to make sure this partnership can flourish and thrive? What systems do we want to put in place for this partnership to flourish and thrive? What do you need from us for this partnership to thrive? And then people can also have honest conversations with you about some of the structures that you're putting in place that aren't particularly helpful to their own kind of vision for themselves and for their communities. And so we're not perfect, but we do try to put that at the center of most of the conversations around accountability, trust, and mutual decision-making in the context of partnerships and in the context of the relationships we're trying to support with the partners and the people in those organizations. So at the center of this is people. Process is important, but at the center of this is people. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks so much, Leah. I know there's also been some questions that have been raised, so we'll come back to that. And I think I'd just like to hear Molupe's experience as a partner with Stephen Lewis Foundation, like that very unique approach, because we know it's just very unique how they engage with their partners. What has been your experience and how does that differ from your other funders, and just for you to share from your perspective as TouchRoots Africa?
Okay, thank you once again, Shila. We have a long-standing partnership with SLF. The approach to risk and compliance has been a simple one. I have a few points which I would like to share when it comes to the approach to risk and compliance. Firstly, the reporting requirements of SLF are easy to follow. The template has a section where they want to know more about the challenges of the organization itself. And I believe that this helps the donor understand its partner even more and be able to identify areas which may put the organization at risk of abusing funds. Reporting timelines are also not tedious. E.g., quarterly reporting, unlike other donors who will require you to report on a monthly basis, and some will even require weekly meetings, where you report on progress and followed up by monthly reporting. While we understand that this is to mitigate against risk, we've also found ourselves spending more time on reporting, which compromises or takes time, which would otherwise be used for the implementation of the project. And the challenge with this is that because you spend more time reporting, there's a risk of not meeting the set targets at the end of the project. SLF always request us to give them our audit reports and financial statements. We get audited on an annual basis. And since the establishment of the organization, we have never had a qualified audit, which gives confidence to the donor that the organization has the ability to use funds. Secondly, SLF does annual assessments. They visit our organization, and for us, we have found this to be helpful because they will look at how the program is being implemented on the ground. What impact is it having? How are we managing our finances? And this helps us because at the end of the assessment, they always give us feedback of what they have found and the gaps they have identified. It also helps them understand the situation on the ground, the local conditions, which leads us, or rather, which leads to some of the actions. Unlike only when they read them in the reports. These assessments also provide us with an opportunity to discuss the challenges we face as we implement our projects, and also to discuss possible solutions to such challenges without saying to us that we have to do things this way or that way. So in other words, they do more listening than dictating. They don't dictate. I think the other point is open communication. We have regular communication with SLF, and I believe this also helps minimize risk. We communicate on a regular basis, and they have always been flexible to allow us to modify the contract such that we respond to the identified need at the time. With other donors, it is not easy to do this. When you have signed the contract at the beginning of the project, you are told that this is what you have committed yourself to doing. And you'll be told that you must find a way around the problem. So that way it becomes a one-way communication and also a top-down approach, which makes it difficult for the implementing organization to achieve its objectives and thereby exposing it to risk. And the fourth one, I think Leah has also talked about it. It's the fact that I think the donors must move away more, or rather the donors must move more towards supporting the locally identified initiatives rather than those which have been prescribed. For instance, SLF is clear on the scope of work which it can support. And for as long as you're within that scope, they will not tell you what to do or what not to do. I will not request money for construction when I know that they don't support construction initiatives, for instance. But for as long as I fall within they can support, they will not say to us that you must, your proposal must cover 1, 2, 3, but rather they would say, what are the needs on the ground, and make sure that whatever needs have been identified from the ground, you cover them within the proposal. This allows us to use a bottom-up approach to identification of needs to be addressed, where our beneficiaries and other stakeholders, community members and community leaders are able to identify their needs, which we thereafter present to SLF in the form of a proposal. As a result, the community members most of the time take ownership of the project, unlike some donors who will come with prescribed projects which can be implemented. Prescribed projects are a limitation because much as it can be a need for the community, it may not be a priority at the time where community members get involved or are consulted in the identification of their needs. Such projects become more sustainable and reduce the risk of diversion of funds. And the last point is that we always share with SLF how we would like to sustain our organization. And most of the time they've been flexible enough to allow us to do what we want and how we can do it. Of course, working within a certain framework. So that way, I think supporting the sustainability initiatives of the organization helps the organization in minimizing, the temptation of diverting funds from what they're intended to. I think let me pause there, unless if there are other questions. Thank you.
No, that was quite detailed, and thanks so much, Molupe. And I'm just telling the audience, I've acknowledged some of the questions coming in. It's just that I want all the panelists to give us their experience from a practical perspective, then we will come to the questions. So now next we are going to Sergey from Catholic Relief. And maybe from my end, I'd just like to understand being an AI NGO, how has the whole agenda on localization influenced your approach to risk and compliance? And do you see your role as an NGO evolving in response to this influence? And maybe just also to share your experiences and some of the practical ways you've tried to implement or handle the risk and compliance within locally led development.
Thank you, Shila, and thank you, panel. I was very humbled to hear about the experiences and the approaches and how like-minded we all are. And I think that's one of the most important things. More people think the same, probably will be able to achieve more. I mean, at CRS, being an international NGO, we are also part of a Caritas Internationalis Federation. And local leadership has been in the DNA of my organization since its founding in 1943. The way we enter two countries, we enter based on an invitation. It's our operating model is accompaniment, support, implementation with, or implementation through our partners. And but one thing that we need to understand is that support, accompaniment, capacity strengthening institutional strengthening requires time. It requires time, patience, being forgiving to each other, and trying to really find out the ways to make things work. Things do not work overnight. Things do not work by putting just flowing conditions in the contract and just following those or responding those. Both funding is a big responsibility. Being a pass-through agency is a big responsibility, as well as the implementation is a big responsibility. So while our approach, while the local leadership did not affect our operating model as far as the implementation is concerned, it changed the dynamic in terms of the pace at which we need to now deliver certain things. And because now it is part of the agenda, it affects the funding, it affects, it puts time pressure. And that T, the time pressure, is in that equation is key. So I think there are good things. That the good thing is that the agenda puts more emphasis on it, brings all the stakeholders together, emphasizes on that this is important and it is very important and we're going to get it, right? So that's a great thing. But the risk is that we may make rushed decisions. We take that patience component out of it, and we might start doing, not our organizations, but maybe the funders will start making decisions based on assumptions that things can work in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a big hurdle. I think the way it all works, I think the pace would be affected in our organization. How did it influence our risk and compliance specifically? I think it did not influence our approach. However, we are more keen to documenting our approaches and making them available to our partners, peer organizations, donors, in demonstrating what types of tools we can contribute to the international community, to the global community, and to have in a toolbox, as my fellow panelists have mentioned, and contribute and be a contributor to be useful in the process. I think, so then the way it influenced it, so we are so we're paying more attention on how to document those good practices that we have been taking and maybe converting them into more time cognitive processes that would generate value and success in a least time possible. And I think balancing between efficiency, which the time brings to the locally led development, is like, let's be efficient, let's do it fast, let's bring efficiency to the sector, and effectiveness is a very hard nut to crack. And I think it's very important to be patient with this process and test things while striving for efficiency, thinking about the continuity and the effectiveness, et cetera, et cetera. I think on the funder's end, I think along with the patience, it's the continuity of what matters. It's part of the formula, and the responsible investments is also part of the formula. So when the funders are thinking about locally led development and operating based on assumptions, like thinking about the continuity and then that patience, that longer term game, and being forgiving and sharing the risk rather than pushing the risk, transferring the risk. We all, in our respective functions, we just were trained to just transfer the risk to other party or avoid the risk or whatever, but we never talked about sharing the risk. because these are organizations that do not have the funding capacity, the financial capacity, or independent financial pools to address these things. So we need to really think through how do we work with these organizations in a trusted manner by not putting them into trouble while we are protecting ourselves in that equation. And I think when we talk about locally led development, it comes with the responsibility, as I mentioned. And I think finding that right balance in sharing those. You asked me about some of the approaches and tools, for example, how we approach certain things. And this were brewing for a very long time before the locally led development became a thing. So in our partner management policies and procedures that we have, that reflect sometimes what we as an organization care about. Also, sometimes they reflect what the donor entities or the funders are caring about. So we built this process of relying on this. There this principle, and I think Jana can paste that link, and so everyone knows what I'm talking about. Their Department of Justice has sentencing guidelines based on which they evaluate whether your compliance program is good or not, whether if something went wrong, whether the organization is responsible for it or it was just an incident and accident and the organization had nothing to do with, about it. So we took the same approach of making sure, say, okay, instead of like just flowing down the requirement and expecting the organization to complete it and verify whether they have done it or not, can we, in the beginning of the project, modify our process and let them know, remind them what they need to do at that time, if it's a time-bound activity, and what do they need to do it for it to get done? Meaning that we are educating, transferring the knowledge right on time as it relates to that compliance process of them knowing, the partner knowing what they need to do, making sure that that activity is budgeted appropriately, make sure that we share our tools with the partner to give them the choice of using the tools in complying with that requirement, and later on checking in with them and following up and making sure that it's done in a way of accompaniment, not by in a way of monitoring necessarily or holding someone accountable. In the end, that's the type of the transparent, very open, collegial, sharing approach that CRS takes in where we can with some of the compliance requirements, where we can do that, where the time thing exists and we know when to remind and we know what the partner would possibly require for them to achieve the objective, et cetera, et cetera. So we use all sorts of tools, and we have many tools in our toolbox, and you can check out our institutional strengthening guide, how we approach various topics, you know, to strengthen capacities. And I don't want to repeat myself and what my colleagues have already contributed, but maybe one thing that I want to highlight, that many INGOs and many donors perhaps in the future, as the locally led development is established, can change the way these things are being progressed. Because with time and patience, if we exercise that type of approach, risk-sharing approach, and accompany our partners right on time, without assuming that they read the requirement, that they know how to do it, et cetera, will, in the long run, train those organizations by doing how to achieve those objectives, right? And in the future, as the capacity, overall capacity grows, that practice can be changed. But I think it's a very interesting way of approaching it and not having surprises. The other one that my team and myself have challenged ourselves with, and we are working, and it's interesting when we're developing our risk and compliance policies, we bring the technical stakeholders and also we bring our partnership and capacity strengthening unit, because we consult with them and they're always at the table and we consult with them. We are thinking doing it this way. How do you think that this will work? Because they are experts in the institutional capacity strengthening. So consulting and making sure that our policies and procedures are also vetted, tested, and approved by our capacity strengthening colleagues who are experts in that field. The other one is that we're developing these policies and procedures, and we're talking about local leadership. So local leadership is not only about the capacity strengthening, but also it's about graduation in the end, right? So having owning the agenda and being independent and maybe being the future primes, right? And having some of those INGOs being subs and helping them to helping from the sub seats. When we're developing those procedures, we say, okay, and policies, we say, okay, can we develop them in a way that we can create a template out of them as a tool and then share with our partners as a tool in their toolbox if they want to adopt those and transfer them into their operation, because we thought all those things through, and maybe those things would be useful for our partners. So those are some of the approaches. I'll be happy to answer any questions, but I don't want to overwhelm you with everything that we do. But yeah, that would be my contribution. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sergey. I've put down some questions that have come up as you've been presenting. So I'll now go for the next 30 minutes, try to ask the questions that came from the audience to each of the panelists. And I'll start with Caroline. I think there's been some questions along the line of how other organizations can be able to use STEP and how they're able to get access to this. And I don't know whether it's Catherine who will also answer this other one, because there's also been a question on whether is it a pilot or is it something that's already been ongoing. There've been quite a few questions on that. So for Caroline and Catherine, maybe start with Caroline and then Catherine.
Yeah, sure. I was replying a little bit in the chat, and maybe because I only had one eye on it, I was misunderstanding maybe what the questions were. I'd understood that some of the questions about the resource portal that I'd been mentioning so that's the organizational strengthening bit of that. So that portal is in the pilot phase. And actually, we built it as it's kind of interesting because it's both, as I was saying, sort of a curated view on relevant resources, but it's also there's a community element to it, where I'm seeing some conversations in the chat from, Hanvovi, I hope I've got your name pronounced right, but talking about how do we understand, what's the why behind some of these things? And why should we care? Why should we be doing these things? And I think that that's really a missing part of the debate as well, that to the point that Sergey was making around, some of these are just important systems and procedures for any kind of organization to have in place. I think sometimes that's a little bit lost as well. And it just feels that the funder is saying, do this. And you feel a little bit resistant to that. But actually there's value in kind of having strong practices and systems, as I was also mentioning at my opening remarks. And so the idea of this portal is not just to be pushing out resources saying, if you want to implement or build a certain policy, this is how you do it. But it's also to say, well, these are why these things are important. This is why you're being asked for this. And also there's a space for funders to be present and participating in that too, so that they can also hear, look, this is actually really difficult. You ask for this, but this is why that's not necessarily easy, or why there might be a challenge or a different way to think about it. And so, our hope with this portal as it grows is that we can actually have that conversation. I think that's really important, and create this kind of, hopefully a sort of safe space where these things can be discussed openly without feeling that, if you say the wrong thing, that will be a negative mark against you. And so the pilot that I mentioned was really created for organizations who've been through the step evaluation recently, just to test that out. So we haven't opened it widely to the world. But, you know, given the interest in this group, I think it would be, you know, if people are interested in learning more, then I can, you know, very happily send an invitation if people will accept that invitation in the spirit of, you know, we're still learning and building this thing. So I'm happy to pick up, you know, as is most, as you'd recommend, from an organizing point of view, to kind of share that information with me. So that's what's pilot. When it comes to participating in STEP and going through a STEP evaluation, we have been a little bit reluctant to just sort of open that up to civil society organizations if there isn't kind of a funder on the other side of that, because we don't want to put them through what is actually quite an intensive process. Somebody also asked, how long does it take? And that's a bit of a question of like, you know, how long is a piece of string? Because it depends a little bit on, you know, how much time the organization, the CSO in this case, has to be able to respond and take the time to what is, you know, a substantial amount of questions. And, you know, we know that, you know, to Leah's point, I think earlier, that, you know, this is not what organizations are about, right? Answering these questions. They've actually got missions to deliver and work to be done. And so, you know, often organizations also go out into the field, and that takes them away from their desks. So it can take quite a long time in terms of days and weeks covered. But we look to make that process as easy and as efficient as possible for the organization. And as I said, as useful for them as possible. So we you know, with evaluators such as Catherine, you know, we are very open to them to respond to any questions. So it is a kind of learning experience on the way as they go through it. Again, to this point of, why am I being asked for this stuff? Why is this relevant to me? So hopefully building that understanding as we go along. So, but, you know, we don't want to raise expectations that you go through an evaluation and then that will suddenly open you up to millions of funders who are kind of ready and waiting for that. So, you know, again, we're still in this developmental phase where we're trying to kind of manage that respectfully, yeah, and appropriately as we grow.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. Catherine, you have something to add?
Well, Caroline has basically answered to that. Yes, it's a pilot, and we have been part of the process of strengthening the process. So, but maybe just to mention that, I mean, this conversation about due diligence really brings a lot of dynamics, and people have different feelings about it. And so as we engage with the STEP process, we really are aware that there are people who are organizations that want to do things differently. The thing is that for me, the issue of trust is one of those core things that one has to build, and so there may be the approaches that may be brought forth, and of course in the STEP process, in terms of the pilot, we really try to encourage conversations with the organizations so that they don't feel that it's just a tool out there that they need to just feel and not feel that there's a human face behind that. So really trying to follow through with the organizations, supporting them to in their response, supporting them even when you send reports, just having a follow-up conversation. How do you feel? What was the experience? Would we do anything differently? Any suggestions that they have? How do they feel about their report? And would they use it? Do they feel that there's an opportunity for them to use it to strengthen themselves? So I think that's really what this process has been, really trying to put a human face to the process. And I think what has happened and experience has been sometimes in due diligence, you may use more and or sometimes people do use organizations that are not necessarily in our sector, and so they don't that feeling of there may be a background of audits, who may have audit firms that may have a section or a consultancy firm that does due diligence. So there's a different lens that brings. So maybe that having an organization that is in the sector really engaging with this process does help want to get the feel of what the organizations are going through, because you experience it, you know what it is. And so I think in this pilot phase, we really did want to put that personal touch to it. And I think that's really been what the process has been about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Caroline. So I'll go to the next set of questions that were addressed to Leah. And one of them was there was a question on with the approach that CLF is taking, and if you have like maybe an organization that's working within a closed civic space, do you have any difficulties in supporting these organizations in this space if you take that approach? And also there was a question on how do you think other donors can be incentivized to take the approach that CLF is taking?
Those two big questions. I'll try to clear my throat and answer both. Yes, we work with some very organizations who are having difficulty navigating civic spaces. I think about some of our LGBTIQ partners who are presently in Uganda, working in a very volatile context with very challenging circumstances at the moment. What does it mean to fund partners in contexts that you know are volatile, ever-changing, that kind of deny their even existence? What does that mean? And we do fund three partners in Uganda. And so it really is, again, understanding local context and building in the flexibility that is required for partners to operate. So if it means that you have to go underground and you can't report for many months because your life is in danger, how do we build in flexibility for that recognition? How do we build in flexible funding so that if you need to pivot your programs and services because your context has changed, that we're able to do that, but that can happen without you having to go through some very administrative processes to change funds across budget lines, when the needs of your community has drastically changed overnight. So I think there's things that we can do premise around communication, because I think that's the only way really is to have open and frank communications. And that means with our partners that we're not just hearing about the good stuff, like when things are going right. And I think, that's about building trusting relationships with folks, because it's really easy to hear about when things are going right, but also having relationships when you can hear about things going wrong. Our financial systems are not functioning well right now. We are having trouble meeting some of these requirements. How do you have open and honest conversations with donors without feeling like there's reprisal on the other end, that your funding will be cut because you're in a particular situation, which sometimes is beyond your control, that may affect your ability to do the due diligence that you know is needed for the project. And so I think it's kind of releasing the expectation that if you don't meet certain requirements, that there's going to be a punitive effect, that funding will be cut. I think the idea is that we want to walk with people along the continuum of their own journey. Like, we're all trying to be our better selves. Our partners are no different. We are no different. We're all striving, and we're all working to get there. It takes time, and I really resonate with Sergey's point around patience. I think we have to be patient with each other, and I don't mean that in, again, like a very like ideal, like everybody just be patient and sing kumbaya, but I mean we deliberately have to be patient with each other in these relationships, because context matters. I think in the context of funding, appreciating the context that folks are in and recognizing that inherently, for the most part, people want to be the best versions of themselves. How do we listen to them in that process? How do we give space and whole space for partners to decide that on their own terms, like offering reflective spaces for partners to think about who they want to be, how they want to get there, the systems they'd like to see put in place. Oftentimes partners just don't have the time to sit down and reflect on what, how to strengthen their systems in meaningful ways, how to operationalize their board in a meaningful way, how to get the board more engaged, because they're so busy doing the work and they have small teams. So I think it is about giving people the space to be able to have these conversations with you or with themselves, and kind of holding space in those moments when things are not ideal. we're all on an organizational journey. We're all trying to strengthen our policies and systems to better reflect who we are as organizations. I think most people want that for themselves. Most organizations want them for that for themselves, and we're patient with ourselves, and so I think we're patient with each other as well. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a period of time. And so if you're going to commit to funding partners, then you have to commit to funding that continuum of their organizational journey. They may not start where you want them to start or where you think is ideal, but that is the reality of working with community-led organizations. Like, if you want to work with community-led organizations, you have to put the practices in place that can facilitate that engagement. So that's question one. I think question two was, I lost question two. I'm so sorry, Sheila.
No, question two was more of the incentive, because it was coming from the aspect that to be able to take the approach that CLF is taking, you need more staff and more engagement. And how can other donors be incentive or funders be incentivized to take this approach?
We need unrestricted funding is what we need. We need folks to recognize that, less restrictions on the funding that we receive so that we can provide partners with the funding that they need in a timely way, in a way that meets their needs, that's not prescribed. And so I think, how do you encourage other donors to have these conversations? Again, I think it starts with honest reflection about what you're doing and why you're doing it. Who is it for? And if it's really for not even for the community, if it's for the people on the ground who the community-led partners are supporting, because that's the end result, right? When you think of the chain, it's to support the community-led organizations in their organizational strengthening, so they can support their communities, so they can be accountable to the communities that they're serving, the people that they're serving, the people that they're representing. And so if the end user is really, the folks in the communities, then thinking about how you make funding more accessible, how you ease the administrative burden on partners, how you absorb as intermediary funders some of that administrative burden yourselves so that you don't offload that where there is severe restrictions on how the funding is used. And so I think those are questions that funders have to continue to have about why these systems are in place, what they're actually doing, who they're serving, and are they meeting the needs of, one, intermediary funders, and two, community-led organizations, and three, the clients that those organizations serve. Is it putting the organization in the best place to be able to meet the needs of the people that they are designed to serve? So, I mean, it's that long layer of, a process. And yes, I do believe that obviously due diligence is important. I believe that we all, again, want to present our best selves, to be accountable, to be transparent, to be responsible. I think it's just about how we do it and how we get there, and the patience, dedication and discipline that's required over time, and really walking with folks along that journey, because we're not all there yet, none of us. So, I think the expectation that community-led organizations should be there and should be there quickly and now and on somebody else's terms are short-sighted. Yeah, and that's what happens when you provide project funding, for projects, right, which is very time-bound, right? You need people to be in that, like, this project is 2 years, so within this 2 years, your systems and structures have to come to a place where we can. But reality is that, especially in health systems strengthening, that work is a continuum. The idea that we can solve something in 2 years or 3 years, or I don't know, I think it's a misnomer. So I feel like you have to be committed for the long haul, and that has its own challenges. But if you are, how do you make that as open and transparent as possible? And how do you engender good communication so that you hear not just about the great things that are happening, but you really hear about some of the things that are just not ideal, and you're able to work with partners on a case-by-case basis about those things that are not the things that they're most proud of, or, so yeah.
Okay, thanks so much, Leah, for your very detailed insights on that. Molupe, the question that came for you was that, are there any other funders that are taking the SLF approach? And have you been able to sometimes engage with funders on and be able to make them be a bit more flexible, like practically, or it's difficult to do that?
Okay, thank you. Yes, there are a few organizations which we have worked with, which operate like SLF, but I think it's only 20% of them. Most of them have this traditional way of supporting the community-based organizations, and I think I was saying that there's a need to move or to empower the local organizations, especially around issues of risk and compliance, because there are organizations which are capable of delivering work on the ground, but because there are issues around risk and compliance, which they need to be capacitated on, you'd find that these big donors would let go of such organizations. So our recommendation is that there's a need to empower the locally based organizations. I was making an example with SLF that they have invested in us as their implementing partner so that we can better deliver the work. Where we express our weakness, they have often ensured that they build our capacity on the identified gaps so that we can better deliver our mandate and ensure that we are compliant with the requirements of the work which has to be done. So this is our recommendation to other donors. And the other recommendation has been that where possible, there's a need to build long-term relationships as it enables the donor to better understand their implementing partner. Where they're able to do this will help them know or understand their implementing partner and what that partner is able to do or what it is capable of. And it will also help them understand their shortfalls and also identify areas where they can build their capacity. This is one way of mitigating against risk, because once you know what your partner is capable of, it makes it easy for you to support them or build their capacity in areas where they are weak. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Molupe, for that. Sergey, there's a question that came also for you, and I think one of the participants wanted to know. You spoke about co-creating the risk and compliance tools together, and they just wanted to know how that co-creation process has been able to enhance your compliance rates. I think your last point when you were saying when you're creating your tools, you don't just do it yourself, it's a very consultative process.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very good question. So we do it and it works very well, and I'll explain how, but it's very hard. It's very hard when you are with the subject matter experts and you pull people together and then you say, now we need to have the more of experts, how it would work behaviorally, the experts who know what it takes to build an organization's capacity, and experts that academically and professionally practiced it over and over and they know it. And it's very hard sometimes to hear it when you're trying to get things done very fast and manage processes efficiently. And the larger the group gets, the more input you receive and more conversations you're having. But I think what has helped is that from the get-go, establishing the vision that this is how we're going to approach our risk and compliance programs as it relates to our partners and as it relates to ourselves that may affect our partners. These are the entities that will need to have a seat at the table. And if they have nothing to add, that's fine. But whatever they need to add, we need to find a consensus. We need to find systems that work for everyone. Sometimes it adds to the cost of our of building our compliance programs, because then now you have more people with more responsibility, etc. And you need to be humble about it. And it's not always about being efficient cost-wise. It's about being effective and seeing that light in the end of the tunnel. And I think that's our operating model. And I'm happy that at Risk and Compliance Shop, we also have adopted that model and are promoting that model. And we are very humbled to call the people who are participating in that model as our partners, as we're trying to achieve our objectives. Again, this might sound very sugary and, oh, that, you know, it all works. No, it's very hard. And there are often a lot of tensions, a lot of stakes, et cetera, but I think as we're leading that process, I think we need to make sure that all that kind of comes into some harmony that produces something that we can later evaluate and say, see, if we haven't done that, if we wouldn't have done that, we wouldn't have this output, or we wouldn't have that output. And I strongly believe that this is going to work, and it's working, and more organizations that can afford doing it, better their programs will be.
Thanks so much, Sergey, for giving us more detailed on how that is actually practically working for Catholic Relief. I am very cognizant of the time. We are 4 minutes to the end of the webinar. We've only covered just a few of the questions that were asked. Maybe we might have another webinar to just cover all the questions. And maybe as I'm finalizing, I'll just ask the panelists if there's anybody who has a last word as we close. If there's anyone who'd like to say anything as we close before I hand it over back to Catherine, please go ahead.
Okay, maybe my last comment would be that I know I did sit in a panel in a conference, and there was the concern that maybe we need to rename, and I think Leah did talk about this, this risk and compliance or risk assessment or whatever. I mean, is there a way in which we can give it the language that doesn't create fear, doesn't create anxiety, which doesn't feel like an outward a process from outside. And so that's maybe food for thought. How can we make, what is that language that we need to use in such a way that it's inclusive and doesn't seem to be overbearing on the partners? So again, the power issue. Yeah, that's my comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Maybe that just needs a whole session on its own on that. Leah, please go ahead.
I just wanted to thank you for hosting this event. I feel like one of the steps is the continued conversation around these pieces and really unpacking them, you know, and I think the more we do that as a collective, the better. I think the more we have time to sit down and think about what is working, what is not working, why we use certain language as opposed to, you know, I think that this is part of the ongoing journey for ourselves as a community in terms of having these conversations more regularly and connecting with each other to have these points of reflection about our various approaches and what's been working and, you know, how we do things and what we're striving to do. I think that this is an important part of like the reflecting on some of the anti-colonial process a bit and, you know, having these conversations. So I appreciate the chance to do that. I think the SLF appreciates it. So thank you.
Thank you. So let me see, Caroline, we are just.
I will do it in 15 seconds, I hope, because it's been a fantastic conversation and I've loved hearing, you know, from all the panelists. I still don't think we've got to the issue of how do you kind of stop all these conversations still happening in parallel, because we could all do the best process for our organizations, but they would still be multiplying those conversations. So that idea of like, how do we bring this together? And plus really promoting and increasing the visibility of all these organizations beyond just their funder relationship. So I'd love to find a way to continue that conversation.
Okay, thanks so much to everyone, Caroline, Catherine, Leah, Molupe, and Sergey, and all the audience. I think our time is up. And thank you so much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For
Bye.
facilitating.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay,
Thank you, everybody.